This was a popular topic in Meetup 2017, so much so that we've brought it back once more due to popular demand. Schoolbox experts will discuss how we've improved performance, security and single sign-on SSO in the recent releases. IT admins, rejoice. Another session for you from none other than product owner and one of our founding directors, James Leckie.
All right, thank you. So today, I know I've got the last session of the day and I've got a particularly exciting topic. So I'll try and keep it light. Today we're going to be looking at a bit about how the systems work. I'm going to do a quick overview of our architecture, the types of issues and things that we face within the system. I'm going to look at authentication, obviously, around how we do authentication, SAML, SSO, those types of areas. I'm also going to then look through security and what we do in terms of security, the types of issues that we have, how we prevent them, types of things that we're thinking about. And then finally, I'm going to touch on performance and talk a bit about what we do in terms of making the system run more performant and what you can also do to help make your system more performant as well. So hopefully there's a bit in that for everyone. I know that all of those sort of things are pretty critical to the function of Schoolbox, and I'm glad I've got a lot of IT people here that obviously look after that stuff day to day. So it's great that you're interested and involved in helping make this product better and better security, better performance, all of those things. So where we start, let's have a look at a quick overview of the architecture. So there's actually two main architectures that we have at Schoolbox. One is our cloud hosted and the other is on-prem. What we're looking at here is the on-prem infrastructure. So typically this is the environment that we work in most schools. We have Schoolbox hosted inside the DMZ. We have a firewall both internally and externally in front of Schoolbox. We interact with the IDP. For those that don't know that one, that's the identity provider. For most schools, that's ADFS, but it could be something else as well. And I'll talk a bit about that later when I talk about authentication. The other one there, DNS and time, is an important thing that we interact with. Time is actually more important than you think it is. Authentication won't work without accurate time. And also our logs, obviously, and all our times inside Schoolbox will be out if time's not correct. So making sure we've got connectivity to time and also to DNS, of course, the two are our critical services that we need to be connected to. Just wanted to quickly talk a bit about the firewall and how we pass through the firewall. We get a lot of challenges with schools around the ports that are open, how they're inspected, the types of security that's on those ports. So let's just quickly go through what we've got here. So on the inbound, coming in from the internet, we have HTTP, HTTPS, and WebSocket. A lot of people said, well, you moved to HTTPS this year only. Why can't we just turn off HTTP? Well, with HTTP, we still require it because we actually upgrade connections that come through to us on port 80, which is the standard port. When you type in a URL, we upgrade those to HTTPS using that port. If you shut that port down, the upgrade won't happen, and anyone who just types in your URL straight into the browser will just get a dead link. So it's really nice to keep that open so that they can be upgraded. We also have links floating around out there that might not have HTTPS in them, so there may be old links. You want to make sure those links still work. We will automatically upgrade the security on any link that comes in via HTTP and upgrade it to HTTPS. So you don't have to worry that we're going to send insecure traffic over HTTP. You will get the security via HTTPS even if you leave that port open. WebSocket, of course, there is also encrypted. We did shut down our unencrypted WebSocket port, so we now only send encrypted WebSocket traffic. Those are the main things that are coming in on our site, other than SSH. For those that are probably aware, we do require that we can log into the server so we can troubleshoot, support the server from time to time. If you've been to our support desk, you might have seen them logging into your server. The way we do that, though, is we encourage schools to lock that down to just our IP addresses. And that's really important because for anyone who's run a server on the internet, port SSH being open, it gets brute forced all day long. If we had that port just open to the internet, we would expect hundreds and hundreds of login attempts every day. So we do request that you lock that port down, and so that port's only accessible to our IP addresses, just to make sure that we're not getting brute forced all day. It shouldn't be a problem if you've got strong passwords, but it's just not worth having that traffic coming into our server. So do lock that port down and make sure it is secured. Moving on, one of the other things on the outbound at the top there, you see I've drawn HTTP, HTTPS, Puppet, APNS going around the firewall. They're our outbound ports. They're the main ports that we communicate outbound on. And we use those ports for things like RSS, VCal, Twitter. All of our APIs, integrations are going out via those ports. We do ask that schools don't put too much filtering on those. We do get a lot of issues where an integration's not working, something's broken, and it generally occurs because on the outbound, we're being firewalled and there's some sort of content inspection, HTTPS breaking going on, proxy filtering, you name it, all the standard things that schools put on their outbound traffic. We do ask that we at least get some sort of whitelisting there so that our Schoolbox server doesn't have the same restrictions that you may put on your students or other users in the school, just because Schoolbox will run into all sorts of problems and they'll be difficult to diagnose if you do have that filtering in place. So obviously, if you want to put filtering, we're not going to stop you, but we do ask that if you do put it on, just be aware that it is probably going to create some sort of issue down the track. All right, let's move on. A couple of other things. I've got the Puppet up there, probably worth explaining what Puppet actually is. All of our servers, whether they're in the cloud or on host, are managed by what is referred to as Puppet. Puppet allows us to deploy updates, configs, security patches to your servers automatically. And what happens with that port there is every 30 minutes, Schoolbox actually calls back to our central control server and asks, are there any updates available for this server? And we do that over that Puppet port. So that's an outbound traffic. The next one, APNS push. That's actually what we use to push mobile messages to your mobile phone. So that's only relevant if you've got push notifications for mobile phones. But just be aware that that is outbound traffic that we're sending out all the time. We do also send to Google, and you might be wondering why Google's not up there. Google is actually over HTTP, HTTPS, so it doesn't require any special ports, but APNS is actually over a special port. For those that are wondering, it's 2195 in my notes. So it does actually have a special port. So sometimes we find we've got trouble with push notifications, and it's often to do with some filtering on the firewall as well. All right, so it's a bit of an overview of where we're at with our architecture. For those that are interested, this is what the cloud looks like. It's a fair bit more complicated. So inside the cloud infrastructure, there's more redundancy built in. There's more servers, microservices, things like that that are running around the system. I'm not going to spend all day talking about this. I probably could. But the cloud infrastructure is a bit different in the way it's approached. This is obviously a work in progress. We're building this out. But that's a bit different in the way we approach the Schoolbox architecture. I'm going to be talking tomorrow a bit more in our roadmap session about where we're heading with cloud and how we're going to utilize it. We're starting to see maybe a spread to using more cloud services even on-prem installations, just because we're running into bottlenecks with just a single server. Obviously, many of you are probably already aware of some of those performance issues that we're running into running in a single server. I'm going to talk a bit about performance later. But those performance bottlenecks, to work around those, rather than asking you to build a cluster inside your network or replicate this type of infrastructure with auto-scaling and all of that sort of stuff, which you don't want to do, we're going to be starting to move and port various services within inside Schoolbox, even on-prem instances, into a cloud-based infrastructure so that you can get the benefits of cloud while still having an on-prem install. So we're going to be working on a pathway to try and migrate you to some sort of composite hybrid solution over the next few years. All right, moving on. Authentication. So authentication primarily is the idea of trying to work out who a person is and what trust do we give them. So authentication in Schoolbox can be done in three main ways, and some of those ways are sometimes hybridized, but we'll talk about those three core ways. Firstly, native Schoolbox. For those that have been with Schoolbox for a long time, this was our primary way to begin with. It's basically setting passwords inside Schoolbox. And when you log in, it just checks the username and password against what's in Schoolbox and logs the person in. Pretty straightforward authentication. For those that are interested in some of the detail, because I love giving a bit more detail, the Schoolbox database stores its passwords in bcrypt. With that password store, it also is in a constantly evolving number of difficulty. What that means is we recognize that bcrypt may not be secure forever, so the implementation of that allows us to increase the difficulty over time, and that will happen automatically, so users don't have to do anything. Passwords will just get harder and harder to crack over time. So if someone does get our database, if someone does hack the system and get that database, you hear about these all the time, 1,000 emails and passwords leaked to the internet. If someone does get our database, it will take them an inordinate amount of time to crack those passwords, and we're constantly increasing that difficulty over time so that hopefully, even if we do have a leak, those passwords won't be cracked. With the native Schoolbox passwords, you can, of course, use some of our inbuilt functionality for resetting passwords. If you've used the reset password functionality, for those that haven't, it works by generating a one-time token that is emailed to the user when they request it. So when you go to the reset password form, they put in their email address, it sends them a one-time token, they click on the link in their email, and then they get sent to a form where they can change their password. So that's how the reset process works. It's the industry standard for secure reset. You can also use that process for initiating new accounts. So if you want to have your parents, for example, come along and sign up, you can use the reset password feature to initiate their accounts as well. Lots of schools don't do it this way anymore, but that's how we've actually done it. For example, with our help centre, and in previous meetups long gone, we actually had a process where we sent everyone an email during the meetup that was the reset password function, and everyone reset their password and started using a test system during the meetup. So you can use the reset function for more than just resetting passwords. You can also use it for initializing accounts. Next up, we've got LDAP. So this is pretty standard now. I think most schools are implementing LDAP as their standard authentication. What this does is it moves passwords out of Schoolbox. Okay, so this means that we no longer check and authenticate using Schoolbox. Instead, what we do is we connect to your LDAP infrastructure. We search for the user using a search string and a username field, and we find that user in the system, and then we try and connect to LDAP using, or bind in LDAP terminology, we try to bind to the LDAP server using that user and the password they supplied. If that is successful, they are then logged into Schoolbox. So for that to work, we need both a record in Schoolbox, a user account in Schoolbox, and a user account in LDAP. For most schools, that's AD, and that's how we authenticate the users. What else? A couple of things with LDAP, just to be noted. We can adjust the search string and the username field, so you can actually adjust how we find users, where you look for them, and how your usernames are formatted. So for lots of schools who have like domain usernames or other interesting structures around their usernames, you can change what we search for and how we match them up. So you can, I know I've worked with some schools here around how they log into their parents log into the mobile app and what they use to log into the mobile app. That can be altered by changing the way the LDAP string works. Moving on to the last authentication method, and this is probably the one that most people are now moving towards, is SAML. So SAML allows us to achieve single sign-on, where you have a central authentication server that does all of your authentication, and all of your apps, your web apps, all forward to that SAML service. So you're able to have your SIS products, you can have your learning management products, you can have your learning tools, all of them can be pointed to SAML, and they all go through the one authentication system. So you get that true single sign-on across all of your apps. And the nice thing about SAML is it works over the internet, so you can use it with cloud apps, you can use it with anything. We're also seeing a trend with SAML towards not just on-prem SAML, but also cloud-based SAML. So we're seeing people using Azure and Google as their identity providers. So you can start to use cloud-based identity systems and StudentNet as well for completing SAML. So it gives you more options for how you implement that infrastructure. Interestingly, I just did a load test for a school, and we SAML Azure AD was included in that load test, and we sent thousands and thousands of simultaneous users to log into Schoolbox, and the Azure AD infrastructure scaled perfectly. So if you're looking for something to really scale up, Azure is a great bet. It was able to handle thousands and thousands of simultaneous logins. Schoolbox fell over well before Azure fell over. So that's a thumbs up to the Azure architecture for that. Let me just go over some of the things with SAML and what it means when you put in an IDP. So firstly, with the IDP, you can't use the Schoolbox password reset. So obviously, because passwords are no longer managed inside Schoolbox, you can't use any of our features. So it's up to the IDP, your SAML provider, to implement all of those features, password kiosks, reset. But the nice thing about having a dedicated provider for your authentication is they can then take it even further. So some of the things we're starting to see authentication providers provide are two-factor authentication, Kerberos authentication. So if you want domain-based logins, you can do that with your IDP. So we now have a lot of schools that they just, because they've logged into their laptop, they started up at school, it will automatically be logged into Schoolbox because the IDP does that. We used to do that in Schoolbox natively. We've now pushed that out so that it's only supported if you do it via SAML. We don't do Kerberos internally inside Schoolbox anymore. It's just too difficult to support. But by pushing it out to the IDP, it can still be achieved, and we just get the response back from the IDP, yes, this user's okay. If you need any more support about any of this stuff and how it all works, just contact support. There's more information online as well about how you can get Kerberos and all of those different setups happening inside ADFS and so on. All right, so one of the things with setting up a SAML provider and IDP is session expiry times. It's worth just considering when your sessions expire and how they expire. Because you've now got two different systems maintaining separate sessions, it's worth thinking about how long those sessions last. So in the IDP, often schools will have a login time maybe of a couple of hours. In Schoolbox, generally you want to have it a bit shorter than what's in your IDP. It doesn't hurt for Schoolbox to bounce off the SAML server every now and then just to check that the session's still alive. Schoolbox will transparently just go to the SAML, check, and then come back. The user probably won't even notice that it's happened, but you don't want it happening too often that it starts to impact on things happening inside Schoolbox. So I would sort of recommend maybe if you've got around a 2-hour time, session expiry time in your IDP, you might want around half an hour in Schoolbox. So just think about how your session expiries work, and also think about the context with that. I should talk more about session expiries. The session expiry is often a thing that lots of schools talk about within their policies around how long a person should be left logged in when they're not using their device. So do think about the context by which your environments work. If you have lots of people on devices that are perhaps workstations or their kiosk type machines, you probably want to log them out fairly quickly. Because if they walk away and they haven't logged out, you don't want someone just to walk up to that computer and start using that session again. If you're particularly sensitive about security, you probably want to have that session short as well. If you've got a lot of people on their own devices, their own laptops, it's a one-to-one school, you might want to up that, because obviously the inconvenience of having to log in all the time is probably far outweighs the security benefits. So you might want to up it. We do have schools that run that at 24 hours. If you are primarily one-to-one and people just always carrying their device, it's probably not an issue to have that as an extended period of time. So just think about how your sessions work and how they relate between the two identity providers. Some developments in the SAML space. So there's been quite a few areas of sort of hybridisation of all these different authentication systems. I know a lot of schools don't put all their users in one place. It makes my day immensely better when I hear that some schools have got parents over here, students over there, and staff over here, and they want it all to be authenticated under the one system. So we have dealt with a lot of hybridization. So we see situations where, for example, a common one is parents aren't in AD, but they're inside, staff and students are in AD. And what we typically do in that environment is we will fall back to the Schoolbox login screen for parents. Parents will log in using a Schoolbox. Goodbye. Parents will log into Schoolbox login native, and staff and students will go in via SAML. Obviously, that creates its own challenges, and one of the things that we've done in 18.2 release of Schoolbox is we've now added the ability to have users opt into what authentication method they use. So what that means is when you come to the login screen in Schoolbox in 18.2, you can have both SAML configured and native configured simultaneously. Previously, the screen would go automatically through to SAML for everyone. Now in 18.2, you can actually have that as an option. So you can have it so that it goes to the login screen and users have to press a button. We started to see this a fair bit in schools. We were doing it as custom work, so we've now made it a core feature. So what that means is you can have your users in Schoolbox, your parents in Schoolbox, and your staff and students in AD. You'll be provided with a button when they get to the login form, log in here with single sign-on or something along those lines, and it will allow them to click that link and they'll just be logged in automatically without having to put in their login details. If they're a parent, of course, that won't work for them. They'll need to put in their login details into the form and then log in. So be aware that that's a new option available for SAML Auth. One option that's not on here, that's on the roadmap, is OAuth. So for those that are sort of familiar with some of the authentication technologies, OAuth is used primarily by the bigger providers for sharing credentials. You would have seen login with Facebook or login with Google. They're forms of OAuth. The OAuth gives us a bit more flexibility than SAML. It allows us to do a few different things that we can't do with the standard SAML model. We are looking at implementing SAML OAuth as a future enhancement as well. With the OAuth stuff, we're primarily building it for our API-based interactions and also for our Digistorm partnership to allow them to interact with our APIs as well, giving us more authentication options for different scenarios. But that's, for us, a bit of a longer-term play. There's also another provider that we've been talking to as well, Clever, who does student sort of styled logins with images, and they're kind of primary focused login systems. And so Clever is an opportunity with using OAuth to allow students to log in by selecting a GIF or something like that matches their GIF. So there's some new options coming along using OAuth that aren't available with SAML. So expect those later this year. We'll be implementing some more OS type authentication options as well. And they're going to follow in that same idea that we've got now with the SAML button. You'll have your login screen and you'll be able to select which OAuth provider you want to log in with. And so schools are going to be able to do things like add Facebook if they want. It's going to be tough to use because you'll have to match on email. But potentially you could have a situation where parents click log in with their Facebook account. I probably wouldn't recommend it, but potentially you could if their email addresses match up with their Facebook email with their Schoolbox email. So there's some opportunities there that are going to be interesting once we've implemented the OAuth provider as well as an authentication. All right. Moving on from authentication. So vulnerability disclosure. So one of the things that sort of has been a bit of a bedrock of who we are from the very beginning is our openness to discuss, talk about vulnerabilities within the system. From the very early days of Schoolbox existence, in fact, some of the very first few days of Schoolbox existence, I rolled Schoolbox out in the very first school it was in, and I got word that a grade 4 kid had hacked into the system. And rather than, I guess, get angry about that, I obviously invited the young kid up to the office. He showed me his vulnerability, and of course he had. Hadn't weaponized it yet, but he certainly had got in. And that then led to a long relationship with that kid. He then worked for Schoolbox for several years and helped us further secure the product. So we've always had a very open, approach to discussing what vulnerabilities we have and talking about how we can sort of fix it. So we are always very happy for you if you have a kid in your school who's found an issue or you found one yourselves. we're always very happy to have that spoken about and talked about. We want to hear about them so that we can get on them and fix them. And we will, and our commitment is we will deal with them quickly as a critical incident. That's how we want to deal with it. So let us know. If you have any bright kids out there, encourage them. It is an environment where we do want to know about these things. So set up bug bounty programs in your school, all of that sort of thing. I think I was up at Shaw and they were telling me about bugs they found the other day. It is something that we do encourage very much. The other thing, it's not just kids that we want to be hacking into our system. We do also have schools trying to hack into our system. So schools often run pen tests, and we do encourage schools to run pen tests from time to time, just to make sure. What I do say about pen tests is make sure you run them on your development server. Don't run them on live, please. We have had schools run automated attack scripts on their live server and have subsequently lost data. So please make sure if you're going to do pen testing, do it on your development environment. And then we can, once you've done that pen test, and if there are any critical issues or there are any things that are raised by that report, please send them through to us. We can have a look at them. We do find that we do get a lot of false positives in those reports. They're fairly blunt instruments generally, but we do encourage just to have a look at them. They have revealed issues in the past and we have fixed them. If you do run a pen test, please share it with us. We're happy to work with you to go through any false positives and fix any issues that might be found in those pen tests. Of course, I don't know if people have noticed this, but we do obviously credit any issues. So from time to time in our release notes and back to our communication, we do notify all schools when we have a security issue. This is a bit of a thing that is a bit controversial because you sort of open yourself up when you disclose that you have a security vulnerability to people that may not have updated yet. So if we've got a vulnerability, someone's let us know, we've gone, great, we've fixed it in the latest release, and thanks to this student, for finding it, but the schools haven't yet updated to that version, we do sort of expose ourselves. So we do want to disclose that we've had a security issue, that we fixed it. We try to keep it as unspecific as possible, but just be aware that that is a risk that schools that aren't running the latest version have to be aware of, that from time to time there are security issues that we fix in the latest versions, and if you're not updated onto the latest major, you may not be covered by them, and they will be disclosed. So just be aware of that. It's not a major issue, and it never really ends in something, but I just want to make sure everyone's clear that that's what's happening. I think that this idea, this vulnerability disclosure program, has built up over many years to create quite a secure environment. We don't get many issues these days. We have had issues in the past, I'm not going to deny that, and we've worked to fix them wherever we found them. So this is part of making sure our platform's secure, and it has enabled us to become pretty strong in this space. And let's face it, we do work in probably the most hostile space there is. Our attackers are on the network, they're in the network, they're smart, they have a lot of time on their hands, they are actively out there trying to find issues. So it is something that we need to be pretty strong in. So it is important we keep working on this. All right, so keeping working on it, let's talk about what they look like. What does an actual, issue in Schoolbox look like? What types of security problems are we going to face? So this is a bit of a discussion about, the issues that we've seen over the years, what shape they take, how they've taken shape, and also what we've done to protect against them. But generally, we're going to find if we're going to have any future issues, they're probably going to be in one of these categories. And I'll just talk a bit about what we're doing and how we're dealing with them. All right, let's start with cookies. So does everyone know what cookies are? We were all pretty clear on that. Schoolbox obviously has a cookie. It's a session ID we send to every user. We have had some attacks in this space over the years. We had one this year, actually, where a student found a way to regenerate their own session ID. And it was a pretty interesting attack. It wasn't really weaponized, but certainly an interesting attack, and allowed that student to gain access to a teacher's session. They needed to clone the session to do it, but they were able to, and that meant physical access, but they were able to clone the session, and it was an interesting one. In that space, the things that we've done, we've made sure cookies are no longer available in JavaScript. So client-side, there's no longer client-side access to cookies. That's been inside Schoolbox for 5-6 years now at least, probably longer. But what that means is later when we talk about cross-site scripting attacks can't attack the cookies, which is really important because if you've got a cross-site scripting attack, the first way to weaponize a cross-site scripting attack is to go after the user's cookies. For those that don't know what that means, typically what I would do is I'd post a cross-site scripting attack into somewhere that I know my teacher is going to visit. It would execute on that teacher's computer and send me their cookie, so that I can then use their session to access Schoolbox and change my marks and everything like that. That's your standard weaponized cross-site scripting attack. We've made it so that those types of attacks can't be undertaken because you can no longer steal a cookie via a cross-site scripting attack. The other thing we did, as we switched over to HTTP only this year, or last year now, we switched on cookies to be HTTPS only. So you can now only access our cookies via a secure connection. And once again, that's just to prevent sniffing attacks. So there were a range of different attack vectors where you could downgrade someone's session and then sniff their cookie. So by ensuring cookies are only secure, we prevented all of those types of attacks as well. So that was just part of our rollover to secure only, HTTPS only, that Sam talked about last year. That was part of that changeover. And I mentioned that interesting regen attack, the session stealing attack. So earlier this year when we saw that attack, we took some extra steps to protect sessions. We now regenerate the session ID fairly frequently. So rather than just having the one session ID for the whole day or for the whole time that you're on that computer, we now make sure that session ID is constantly changing. So throughout the day, it's like a rolling token, you know, so it only lasts a certain amount of time and then we change it over to a new session ID. What that prevents is even if I do get physical access to my teacher's computer, I plug in my drive or I send their cookie to my computer, but hopefully with that session regen ID, by the time they get it onto their computer, it's logged out and not usable. So by doing that, we're trying to prevent that type of attack. That's cookies. So one thing I should mention about cookies is there's a really dangerous form of cookie called Remember Me. Remember Me lasts for a long time, and that obviously has a bunch of security ramifications that you need to be aware of because it's unlike a standard session, it's a session that lasts for a really long time. So if you have Remember Me on, you are exposed to a different bunch of things like stealing cookies. You wouldn't go after the session cookie, you'd just go after the Remember Me cookie, and that would allow you to continue to log in for a much longer period of time. So just be aware that Remember Me comes with its own form of security issues. So I'm sure everyone's aware of that Remember Me is pretty dangerous, but just be careful with those. All right, so moving on to cross-site scripting. So cross-site scripting, these are probably the most ubiquitous type of attack in the web. Sites all over the internet have cross-site scripting. All the time you hear about some sort of attack where they've got access to the database or something like that, it's almost inevitably a form of cross-site scripting or SQL injection. So these are the two main ones that we see on the internet. Just with cross-site scripting, we do a lot of filtering of content that you put into the system. So whenever you know the editor inside Schoolbox, it's got all the buttons on it. That's what we call our HTML editor. Anywhere that you're putting HTML into a CMS, you're at risk of having a cross-site scripting attack injected in as well. So any HTML content that gets put into Schoolbox needs to be sanitized so that no content ever gets through to a user that can have attack code in it and be executed. To do with that, we do things like iframe filtering, you know, the iframe whitelists that everyone always whinges about to me, like, why do I have to whitelist all these iframes? That's one of the attack vectors for cross-site scripting. If you allow any iframe to be embedded, I guarantee you a student's going to create a website with a bit of exploit code in it and iframe it into a CMS field. So just be aware that's why the iframe whitelist exists, to protect you from cross-site scripting. If you allow iframes, just remember that that is the potential vector for that content to come through into Schoolbox as well. Now, there are protections, but you do need to be aware that that's a potential hole that you're allowing through. We do a whole lot of scanning around there, so we also sanitize all the content. But one of the things you need to remember with our cross-site scription sanitization is that we only sanitize on output. That means that cross-site script attacks can exist inside our database. So a student can put JavaScript code into our database and it can sit there, but when a user views it, we will never give them that code. It's probably not a massive issue, but just be aware that sometimes when schools, for example, take our data and repurpose it into other views, they don't sanitize it. And all of a sudden, the student's now got another vector to cross-site script attack. So just be aware that if you're taking data out of our database and using it somewhere else, it is not sanitized for cross-site scripting. It needs to be sanitized by you. We don't consider it safe. We don't consider data in our database safe. So just be aware of that. SQL injection. Now this is probably the most fun one. That same kid that I talked about before, shortly after finding an exploit inside Schoolbox, went on to find an SQL injection inside Synergetic. He had a great, we got that one patched pretty quickly, but just so you know, there are SQL injections are everywhere, and they're probably fairly common type of attack. They are something that we need to sanitize all inputs to ensure that we don't get SQL injections. Our modern infrastructure does this automatically, so our developers don't even need to think about it too much. Our older infrastructure, we had to do it manually, but these days it's mainly taken care of automatically, so we don't even think about it too much. But those from time to time do crop up. I haven't seen one in Schoolbox for a long, long time, so I'm cross fingers. Hopefully that one's a thing of the past. But it's certainly one we always keep an eye out for, and we always talk in our team, and this is probably another thing, we talk in our team about these types of exploits as well. So whenever a new junior developer comes in, we always talk about what the types of vectors are, and this is one of the ones that we teach them about. All right, moving on. Data security, privacy. So this is probably the big new area. So deep breath. So this is the challenge now is it's not so much exploits, it's more about how we manage the data that we have and who we show it to. And this may not even be an active, we may not even be meaning to do this. It might just happen. So the types of things that we obviously need to do is ensure the right people have access to the right information. This is a partnership here because we don't always know what the right information is for the right people, and that's going to be different for different schools. Also, we often provide tools that may allow you to provide information to the wrong people. And so we need to talk about what it is and how we share data in the system. A good example of this is we've been having a discussion recently about parent emails and how available and accessible they are inside Schoolbox. Obviously, you want to have them available. You want to be able to send emails to parents and things like that when you need to. But you don't want certain people to have access to those emails. And so there's a whole lot of security policy around who gets access when. And in some schools, it's okay for parents to have access to other parents' emails. In other schools, it's not. And it's very hard for us to get the right balance there. So you do need to be well aware that this isn't just on us to maintain that data security and privacy. It is something that we need to work together to look at. I'm going to be actually talking a bit more tomorrow about privacy legislation in particular. So I'll do a bit more work explaining what data we have inside Schoolbox, how we look at security privacy around that data. So if you want to know more about that particular area, I'm going to do a whole presentation tomorrow on it and what the types of legislation we're looking at, how they impact us and how we manage data. But I'm going to just wanted to bring that up because we get a lot of bug reports about this parent got access to this data, this student got that access to that. And often it's not something that we did. Often it's to do with the way that information was shared, who published it, the way they published it. Sometimes it's something we can change. Sometimes we can retract that information. Sometimes we can forget about it, remove it out of the system. But we all need to be aware that we both play a role in preventing those types of bugs. All right. That's enough about bugs. I don't want to hear more about bugs. Hopefully we have no more bugs in the system. Probably not likely. Let's move on to performance and have a quick chat about how the system works and how we do performance. So, network. Where are we starting? Network. Number one. So, interestingly enough, with this performance of a server, the network is actually our biggest bottleneck, believe it or not. It's always the issue. And it's funny because it's not the issue in the way you think it is. So I'll just talk a bit about how we see that playing out inside Schoolbox. So firstly, obviously page response time is critical. We want the page to respond quickly. Inside Schoolbox, to deliver a page, we often require connections out to several third-party systems. So every time you load a page, it's not just loading it between you and the server and Schoolbox. It's actually then going out to Twitter, Synergetic, several other systems in the process to generate that page. So all of those things have their own latency, and each time they have a bit more latency on them, the page takes a bit longer to respond. So if you're seeing a page that's taking 3 seconds to load, it's probably not all about Schoolbox. It's probably also about how long that other system took to respond over the network and how that network has impacted that page. So we get a lot of issues that ultimately end up being a network issue. So those things are why we have a lot of schools with on-prem installs, because latency is important, and putting Schoolbox next to the SIS is important because a lot of that's live, and that's our number one bottleneck within Schoolbox. So making sure all the services inside Schoolbox everywhere are running fast and can respond are going to make sure Schoolbox is fast and can respond quickly. All right. Just on the network. So the network, one of the things that we do a lot of, because we have so many network issues and because it's our biggest bottleneck, is we build a lot of caches. Schoolbox is full of caches. Every time you go to your SIS, we go via a cache. Every time we go to Twitter, we go via a cache. So everything in Schoolbox is cached, and that's to try and cut the network out of the delay. So those caches are stored in files, they're stored in Redis in memory, and there's numerous ones of them. Some of the ones, I mentioned Twitter will be cached, VCal will be cached, all of those different things will be cached. They all have different times, so some of them are 4 hours, some of them are an hour. I think the SIS cache is 5 minutes because we want that to update fairly frequently. Some of these are configurable. SIS cache is definitely configurable. So just be aware that those caches exist and that they can have an impact on performance as well. The issue with caches, of course, is when they don't have the data in them. So one of the things we find is start of the year, everyone comes back from school and logs in. All no cache, fresh hits, huge load, spike, and the server just comes to a screeching halt. And that's because our caches haven't been populated yet. And then, an hour or two later, it all just settles down and it's all fine again. But there's often that little bit of time where those caches haven't been fully populated, and we just need to load them up, fill them with data, and things start to run a bit more smoothly. But just be aware that caches do exist, they do play a role. They're our attempt at making performance better. But for the cold stuff, the cold hits, it's really up to the school to make sure that they're working to make sure all of their services are fast. Their internet connection's fast, their SIS is fast, their SAML server's fast. All of those things will impact on how fast your Schoolbox runs. One of the other things I recommend is that Schoolbox traffic is prioritized. Because we are so dependent on having a page load based on internet traffic, if we're competing with all the students who are watching YouTube, our pages are going to load slow just because everyone's watching YouTube on your network. So if you've got the opportunity to QoS your traffic, it's worth considering putting some QoS on the Schoolbox outbound HTTP, HTTPS traffic. It's just worth something to think about. All right, moving on. Our next bottleneck, the SIS. So I talked about the SIS system. How long have I got? Oh. I'll move quickly. I thought I wasn't going to have enough time. So SISs, we cache those, I mentioned that. I can't highly recommend. Tuning your sys is probably the most biggest impact you can have on Schoolbox performance. So having a fast, optimal running sys is really going to benefit Schoolbox performance. So that's a big one. Moving on to RAM, we frequently run out of RAM on servers. It's probably the first thing that goes wrong on a Schoolbox server. If you ask the support team, they're always coming to me and saying this server's out of RAM. Obviously, just giving the server more RAM isn't always going to solve that problem. Running out of RAM is actually a symptom, not the cause. But I'll just give you some idea of how this works. Each request in Schoolbox uses 100 meg of RAM. If we need to serve 100 requests simultaneously, that's 10 gig of RAM. Okay? So if your server is serving 500 users simultaneously, or if that's your target, you need 50 gig of RAM to do that. That's the current benchmark for how that works. There's other things that use up RAM as well. So we have memory caching. I talked about caches before. They take up 1 to 2 gig of memory. The DB takes about 400 meg of memory. So 16 is our absolute minimum. 32 gig is our recommended. If you're really, a big school, 64 gig is probably where you want to be. Disk, but like I said, RAM is not the often we run out of it, but it's not the problem. So just be aware of that. If you're running out of RAM, it may be a symptom of slow requests or something like that. Because I talked about the requests. 100 requests simultaneously takes 10 gig. If your requests are taking 5 seconds to respond, you're going to have many more simultaneous requests happening. If your request only takes 100 milliseconds, you can actually get through much more requests simultaneous. You'll have much less simultaneous requests on your server. So just be aware that the impact of a slow network and a slow sys results in more RAM being used because you've got more requests that are sitting there waiting to finish while we're getting the data from your network. Finally, CPU, Schoolbox disk actually. Disk is broken into two areas. The OS, we always say go on SSD because we want fast random access. That's where the DB lives, and it's also where logs live. So make sure your DB and your logs are on SSD. For the storage, your big drive, that can be just sitting on a slow spinning Rust, doesn't matter. CPU, Schoolbox is really heavily threaded. Every request is on its own thread, so you can have many CPUs, and Schoolbox will use all of them. So feel free to chuck lots of CPUs at it. It's probably not our bottleneck very often, that's why it's down the very bottom. But, having 4 minimum, 16 is probably not unreasonable for a well-served server. So just be aware of that. Just got one more slide. For those that aren't aware, we do watch all of this stuff on your servers. We report all of this data back to a central management console where we can watch. You can access this as well. And we're now launching soon the ability for you to have this data sent to your own Grafana system if you want to integrate this into your own dashboards. For those that haven't seen this before, it goes through all of the CPU load, disk load, database load, all the different key components of Schoolbox are graphed here. You'll often see when you call up support and ask about a performance issue, they'll send you screenshots of this talking about what they've diagnosed, where the blockage is, what the problem is. So you might see this turn up in support tickets. And a little bit of an extension on that, beyond performance, we're actually working at the moment on engagement reports in this same platform. We're now capturing a whole lot of engagement data about your server, logins, uploads of files, forum posts, pretty much any interaction is being logged now to a central Grafana database where we're going to be building you a dashboard so you'll be able to see all your engagement data over time. Has everyone used Grafana before? Yep, good. So it's a really great tool. You can zoom in and out. You can get different cuts of the data. So we'll be providing some more dashboards around engagement in that space as well very shortly. So yeah, that's available if you want to contact support. They can give you access to your performance data so you can see how your server's running. All right, that's it for me. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody. So obviously we run over time, but now is the cocktail party. So feel free to corner James and ask him questions at the cocktail party. And then obviously we're running sessions again tomorrow, so we hope that we will see you all tomorrow. So Again, a round of applause for James.